Welcome to the fourth of 8 lectures in the Princeton Adult School series on globalization. Next week's lecture will be given by John Eikenberry, the Professor of Politics and International Affairs, and the title will be International Security, the Dilemma of American Power in an Age of Globalization. I'm Dr. Mark Brannon, and I'm a member of the board of the Princeton Adult School, and it's my pleasure to introduce Robert Wuthnow tonight. Professor Robert J. Wuthnow is the Gerald R. Angliger Class of 52 Professor of Social Sciences here. He is also the director of the Center for the Study of Religion, and currently he chairs the Department of Sociology here. Professor Wuthnow received his B.S. summa cum laude from the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas in 1968, and his Ph.D. in sociology from the University of California at Berkeley in 1975. His resume is very long, and I just selected 3 books that he has written recently just to summarize, because I think the titles would show you the breadth of the interest that he brings to this topic. So 3 of his recent books are titled All in Sync: How Music and Art Are Revitalizing American Religion, published by the University of California Press 3 years ago. 2 years ago, he published Saving America, ? Faith-Based Services and the Future of Civil Society, and that was published here at the Princeton University Press. And then just last year, also published here at Princeton, is his book, America and the Challenges of Religious Diversity. Tonight's lecture is titled Globalization and American Christianity. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Wuthnow.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening. How is the sound level for those of you in the back? Is it okay? All right, good. Well, what I'm going to be talking about this evening is some research that I've been doing over the past 3 years on the international activities of American Christianity, especially congregations, especially churches, but more broadly speaking about other organizations as well. And this, in a way, for me, is what I sometimes describe as my post-9/11 project, because it's a project that came increasingly in my mind as I thought about how the world has changed since 9/11, and especially how we in the United States need to be, and indeed are, much more closely connected with the rest of the world. But in another respect, it's also the culmination of a very long-term amount of thinking that I've been doing over the course of my career as a sociologist about such issues as what is sometimes called the modern world system, global inequality, global culture, and so forth. As you know, especially if you've been to previous of these lectures this year, globalization is a very important issue in our world, and in my discipline, in sociology, it's become a very popular topic for people who look at it through the lens of politics or through looking at immigration, as Doug Massey did the last lecture, or in other respects. Globalization is, the way I define it, at least, the increasing flow of goods, services, people, and information across national boundaries. And all of that means that our world, and we in it, are much more closely connected with people in other parts of the world than was ever true in the past. So with that context in mind, it stands to reason that American religion would also be more closely connected with religion in other parts of the world. As it turns out, that's not the way a lot of scholars have thought about it. In fact, I was quite surprised when I started reading the relevant literature to find that there was something called a new paradigm, or sometimes called a global Christianity paradigm, that denies that U.S. Christianity is connected with Christianity in the rest of the world at all. Quite surprising. This is especially well articulated in a book that some of you have probably seen. It's a book by historian Philip Jenkins called The Next Christendom. It's a book that was published in 2003. It received an enormous amount of attention when it came out. A short version of the argument was also featured in Atlantic Monthly, and Jenkins did a lot of talking, but by his own admission in the book, it's an argument that was also expressed and had been expressed for a decade or so by many scholars in the field of international religion, international Christianity. In propositional form, that new paradigm or that new Christendom narrative can be summarized as follows. Christianity on a global scale experienced significant growth during the 20th century, and this growth will continue. The majority of Christians now reside outside of the United States and Europe. The growth of Christianity in these other parts of the world has been exceptionally strong and will remain so. This growth is happening primarily through the efforts of indigenous Pentecostal and other so-called spirit-filled churches. And for this reason, the argument goes, Christianity in the global South is especially vibrant and dynamic. And during this same period, the argument goes, Christianity has been weakening in the global North, and as a result, countries in the South are now actually sending missionaries to the global North. Well, it's an interesting argument, obviously. But it's not simply a set of propositions. It's also a story about how things were and how they have changed. And as a narrative, it's a paradigm that has additional drama and becomes intellectually compelling and even emotionally engaging. If you put it in narrative form, the story goes something like this. Once upon a time, indeed not very long ago, Christendom was located in Europe and the United States. The rest of the world was not Christian and needed to be saved. To save the world, the United States and Europe made heroic efforts for a long time to send missionaries. These efforts, while laudable, never worked quite as well as expected and often caused resentment. Europeans were especially guilty of combining missionary activities with imperialism and colonialism, but they say North America was largely uninvolved in that problem. Then after World War II, many colonies became independent nations with nationalist and even communist regimes that caused doors to be closed to missionaries. So at that point, all hope seemed gone. But then a surprising thing happened. Once left to themselves, people all over the non-Christian world began to discover Christianity on their own. Soon Christianity was flourishing everywhere. That is, everywhere but the United States and Europe, where it was declining. As a result, then, the center of gravity of Christianity was now located in the global South. In those countries, especially in Africa and Latin America, evangelical and Pentecostal churches were growing at a furious pace, and a new Christendom was being born. In this new heartland of Christianity, faith was more vibrant, more authentic, and closer to that of the early church than it had been for a long time. In an ironic historical twist, this new Christendom in the global South would probably be the source of hope for the decadent people living in the United States and Europe. It would send them missionaries and challenge their secular assumptions. It might also have to wage war against the historic antagonist of Christianity, especially Islam. Well, that, in a nutshell, is the new Christendom narrative. It's been attractive for too many reasons to get into here this evening, other than to say that it fits well with the idea that missionary activity somehow was associated with colonialism and imperialism and then ended with the end of the colonial period. And it's also given scholars like Jenkins hope that Christianity is flourishing elsewhere in the United States, elsewhere in the world, even though they don't think it is in the United States. The problem is that it flies in the face of everything that we know about globalization. If trade and communication and politics and migration are bringing the world closer together, and yet Christianity outside of the United States is said by these scholars to be totally disconnected from Christianity inside the United States, that's hardly a plausible argument. And when we begin considering the evidence, it ceases to be a credible argument. What the evidence shows is that the global outreach of churches in the United States is at an all-time high. By every conceivable indicator, the international ministries of U.S. churches have been increasing in recent years. This engagement abroad, in fact, is far more extensive than it was at the supposed height of global missions in the 1950s. And it is more diverse in purpose and organization than ever before. Yet this is a story that's largely gone unrecognized, and indeed has been badly distorted by the proponents of the New Christendom paradigm. So the focus of my lecture this evening will be the following. First, to give you some evidence about the global outreach of U.S. Christianity. Second, to discuss some of the reasons for this increase. And then third, to briefly consider some of the challenges ahead as religious leaders and indeed all of us continue to think about America's place in the world. So first then, some evidence about the global outreach of U.S. churches. Spending by U.S. churches on overseas ministries has risen to nearly $4 billion annually. That's an increase of almost 50% after inflation in a single decade. The number of full-time missionaries serving abroad has increased steadily over the same period and is significantly larger than a half century ago, when the missionary movement was supposed to be at its height. Figures collected by Protestant mission agencies and denominations in 2001 showed that there were 42,787 U.S. citizens working full-time as missionaries in other countries. And that represented an increase of approximately 16% over the previous decade. And again, it was significantly higher than the comparable number in the 1950s. In addition to that number, 65,000 non-U.S. citizens and foreign nationals were working in other countries under full sponsorship by U.S. agencies. Besides this, as many as 350,000 Americans had spent between 2 weeks and a year abroad serving as volunteers, religious volunteers. And short-term mission trips have become even more common. Although hard numbers are difficult to find, my best estimate from a national survey of church members that I conducted last year is that 1.6 million U.S. churchgoers participate in short-term mission trips to other countries every year. I suspect some of you have been on such trips. The median number of days abroad by these short-term volunteers, not counting travel time, is 8 days, meaning that short-term volunteers contribute approximately 30,000 person years to U.S. mission efforts abroad. That's about a fourth the amount provided by professional missionaries. The dollar value of this effort, using rates established by Independent Sector in Washington, is approximately $1.1 billion. That's not counting preparation time and travel days. And so at an average cost of $1,000 a trip, transportation totals another $1.6 billion. And speaking of churches and church members, the national survey I conducted last year shows clearly that international ministries are something that nearly all congregations are supporting in one way or another. And I don't just mean missionary activity, whatever that may mean. Only one church member in 6 says that his or her congregation does not in some way emphasize international programs. 3/4 of church members say their congregation has had an offering in the past year to raise money for overseas relief and hunger projects. In more than 80% of those congregations, there has been more than one such offering in the past year. 3/4 of church members also say their congregation has supported a missionary working in another country in the past year. About half say their congregation sent a group abroad in the past year to do short-term missions or relief work. About half say their congregation has hosted a guest speaker from another country in the past year. And other ways of connecting to the wider world are not as common, but are still present in a significant number of congregations. For instance, nearly 4 members in 10 say their congregation has a committee that focuses on missions or other international programs. 1/4 of church members say their congregation has held a meeting in the past year at which questions about war or peacemaking has been the main topic. 1/4 also say their congregation discussed the United States policies toward other countries in the past year. And one congregation in 5 has a full-time staff member with responsibility for overseas missions or other global ministries. Now, having mentioned these survey results, I should mention that this was a nationally representative survey. It was conducted among people who said they were church members or who attended a church at least once or twice a month. And so 41% of the adult public currently fits that description. The survey was based on a sample of approximately 2,300 of these churchgoers. And as I mentioned, it was conducted last year, and we spent about 6 months in the field making sure that we did a thorough job and got a decent response rate. In addition to some of the questions I've just mentioned, we also asked people about their own personal involvement in some of these international activities. 3/4, or 76% to be exact, said that they had given money in the past year for some international relief or hunger project. And this, by the way, I think is a credible figure. For instance, another survey found that 36% of the public had given money just for tsunami relief through their churches. Nearly half of church members said that they had attended a meeting in the past year at which a missionary or a religious worker from another country had been the main speaker. 18% had participated in a church meeting at which war, peace, refugees, or some other international issue was the main topic. 20% had done volunteer work that was specifically concerned with helping people in other countries. And 14% said they had signed a petition or written to a political official about an international issue, such as trade, debt relief, poverty, war, or human rights. Now, naturally, there are differences in these various activities depending on the denominational tradition of the congregation. But as it turns out, those differences are actually quite small. Whether it's mainline Protestant or evangelical Protestant or historically black Protestant or Roman Catholic, all of these churches are extensively involved in one way or another in international activities. The major differences actually had to do with the size of the congregation more than anything else. Larger congregations simply have more resources to sponsor these activities. If one asks, though, what are the distinguishing marks of the most transcultural congregations, That is the 20 to 25% of congregations that are most involved in these international activities. 4 factors stand out most clearly. Number 1, a theological emphasis on sharing the gospel globally. 2, a missional emphasis at the center of the congregation's identity. 3, an organizational mechanism, especially a missions or a global outreach committee. And 4, an intentional leadership strategy, especially one that builds on existing energies and focuses those energies on some specific projects. But of course, the transnational work of U.S. Christians is by no means organized only through local congregations. Centralized boards and agencies, or what are sometimes called parachurch organizations, are also playing a larger role in linking U.S. Christians to other countries. On the missions front, consider the International Missions Board of the Southern Baptist Convention. Its current year budget is $283 million. It supports more than 5,000 full-time foreign missionaries, and that's a 5-fold increase since 1955. The support staff of the Southern Baptist Mission Board in Richmond, Virginia, includes 500 full-time employees. The board is also responsible for training and deploying approximately 30,000 short-term mission volunteers every year. And through its missionaries and volunteers, the board claims approximately 600,000 baptisms annually worldwide and assists in the work of nearly 100,000 overseas churches. To take a different example, Campus Crusade for Christ has an annual budget of $420 million, and about a third of that goes for overseas activities. The most visible of those activities was the Jesus Project. Some of you have probably heard about a film about the life of Jesus. From the project's inception in 1979 through 2005, an estimated 42 million video cassettes and 13 million audio cassettes were distributed, which reached an estimated 6 billion people in 105 countries, and were believed by the organization to have resulted in approximately 200 million decisions for Christ. And then to take a rather different example on the relief and development front, World Vision has overseas aid expenditures, this was in 2003, of $513 million. That's an inflation-adjusted increase since 1981 of 326%. And Catholic Relief Services spent $479 million overseas. In total, the top faith-based relief organizations in the U.S. were spending more than $2.3 billion overseas. So those are just a few examples. So I think the extent of U.S. Christianity's global reach is in many ways stunning. It is, of course, consistent with the Christian gospel expressed in the New Testament teaching known as the Great Commission. It's expressed in Mark 16:15, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Acts 1:8 emphasizes the same mandate, you shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and unto the uttermost parts of the earth. And yet we ordinarily don't think of churches, I don't think nowadays, as global emissaries. It's much more common to emphasize the local character of churches. For instance, finances are often a telling indication of this local orientation. Most congregations are affiliated with a denomination or some denomination-like entity, and yet the typical congregation expends less than 5% of its total budget supporting those external organizations. Nearly all congregations own their own building, have their own clergy person or persons, and those are the items that amount for the largest share of their budget. Weekly worship services are the centerpiece of most congregations' activities. And even though it's possible to watch religious services on television, most people who participate at all participate actively in a local congregation. It turns out also that even with suburbanization and sprawl, the average person still lives within 10 minutes drive or walk of their congregation, so they're local in that sense as well. And we also know from ethnographic studies of churches that people gravitate to churches where they think there are friends that they can be friendly with, and where the church seems warm and home-like. So in all of those ways, the local character is what we think about most. As it happens, previous research has looked a little bit at some of these international activities, but it turns out has badly underestimated these activities. For instance, among sociologists who study this kind of thing, there was a quite prominent study a few years ago. The survey was done in 1998. It was called the National Congregations Survey. It's done by a sociologist at the University of Arizona named Mark Chavez. And that study showed that 8% of Americans attend congregations that sponsor or participate in, quote, programs explicitly mentioning beneficiaries outside the United States, including crop walk. But it's likely, when the question was worded that way, especially with the reference to crop walk, that directed respondents thinking to social service or possibly to fundraising activities, and so they weren't even thinking about foreign mission activities or other kinds of humanitarian activities. There was also a study of individuals, a national study by the political scientist John Green, that asked people about congregational support for international activities. And when people were asked if they'd given time or money to support international programs, only 11% said they had done so through a religious venue at all, and another 13% said they had done so through a secular venue. But those questions didn't ask about any informal activities that people might have been involved with. So it seems to me that what we're finding flies in the face of previous research that suggests that congregations are just simply focused on the people who belong to those congregations or possibly people in the local community. Well, what then are the reasons for this recent increase in the global role of U.S. churches? That's my second topic. International communication, including actually spending time in other countries, is one of the key factors driving the globalization of American Christianity. As one indication of how much such communication has increased, international telephone calls to and from the United States grew by almost 50% between 1998 and 2002 alone. Another indication is that the number of air passengers traveling from the United States to other countries grew from about 10 million in 1975 to nearly 60 million in 2000. And then from our survey, we found that nearly 2/3 of active church members in the United States have traveled or lived in another country, 2/3. And 1 in 7 has lived in another country for at least a year. More than 4 in 10 have friends or relatives who live outside the United States. Vacations, foreign study, military service, business, all contribute to these international connections. We found that 11% of active church members, for instance, have served in the armed forces. And among church members who are currently working, 37% say they routinely interact with people from other countries at work. And of course, immigration is another source of transnational ties. For instance, approximately 22 million immigrants arrived during the last third of the 20th century, and perhaps as many as 7 million undocumented workers came as well. And that impact has been especially strong among younger people, especially younger men. The percentage of young men in their 20s who were foreign-born jumped from 4% in 1970 to 18% in 2000. Currently, 8% of active church members are immigrants, 14% are children of immigrants, and 74% attend congregations in which immigrants are present. So besides having personal ties and experiences, then of course Americans consume information about the rest of the world through the media. Among active church members, 38% claim to be very interested in news about other countries. 3/4 watch news about other parts of the world on CNN and other such programs on television. 1/4 read about international news at least once a week in a major national newspaper. And 40% obtain information, they say, about foreign events at least once a week from the internet. So that's one source of these increasing connections. A second important source of globalization among U.S. churches is the growing number of foreign congregations and religious organizations, that is, in other countries, in which relationships and cooperative partnerships can be established. According to one source, the number of local worship centers in Africa grew from 282,000 to 603,000 between 1970 and 2000. In Latin America, that number grew from 131,000 to 462,000. And in Asia, from 234,000 to 1.1 million. And equally important, the number of international non-governmental organizations, or INGOs, has increased. For instance, figures compiled in 1966 and then again in 1988 showed the total number of INGO memberships in Africa had grown from 76 to 264, and in Asia from 129 to 407. And another fact is that so many people in the world speak English. For instance, about 375 million people, not really that many in terms of world population, have English as their first language, but another 375 million have English as their second language, and then 750 million also have learned English to the point that they can use it at least as a second or third language. So 1.5 billion people worldwide. Then a third factor contributing to the globalization of American Christianity is the sheer preponderance of resources. If Christianity were ever the faith of the downtrodden, it's certainly not in the United States. For instance, nearly half of active church members have family incomes of at least $50,000, and more than a quarter, have incomes in excess of $75,000. Now, on a per capita basis, that's about the same as the national average, but the national average in inflation-adjusted dollars has doubled in the last 3 decades. And during the 1990s alone, philanthropic giving to religion grew by 70%, and donations to international organizations tripled. So even though few Americans donate more than 1 or 2% of their income to religious causes, the nation's affluence and the large percentage of church goers in the United States makes it possible for U.S. Christians to play a very important role in the wider world. Also, besides these individual donations, it turns out that there is quite a bit of funding from private donations and even from the U.S. government. Not only are U.S. churches replete with resources, these resources are also increasingly concentrated in megachurches, a fourth factor in the globalization of American Christianity. Megachurches, defined as congregations of at least 2,000 members, make up fewer than 2% of all congregations, but they now make up about 1 in 6 of all churchgoers in the United States. And those numbers are increasing. Congregations of all sizes encourage people to be involved in overseas activities, but megachurches simply have the resources to do more of that. For instance, at Willow Creek Church in suburban Chicago, this is a congregation that raised almost $2 million the first time it tried to raise any money for international ministries in the early 1990s. That was on one Sunday. And nationally, 60% of the members of megachurches report that their congregation focuses a great deal or a fair amount of attention on people living outside of the United States. 53% of these megachurch members say their congregation emphasizes helping people in other countries a lot, and 44% say they emphasize international ministries a lot. I'll give you an example. This is a non-denominational church in California, has a membership of about 12,000, has a weekly attendance of about 7,000. It partially supports, at least partially supports, 27 or 28 missionary families who work in 20 different countries. One of the pastors is in charge of recruiting and training and supervising the congregation's missionaries and overseeing their support. They have a whole bunch of pastors on their staff. And this pastor sometimes identifies young people he thinks have potential. These are usually people who've gone on a short-term mission trip, and then he works with that person over a year or more, and then eventually sends them out. He also visits all of these missionaries at least once a year in their various locations. And since that's a fairly big job, there are also volunteers who help to do that. The congregation then is organized into small cell groups, and each of the cell groups adopts a missionary family and supplies some of its monthly support and stays in contact with that family by letter or by email. The missionaries, for their part, largely are autonomous. They make their own decisions. Some are involved in evangelism, some work at medical clinics or hospitals, some do teaching, some do construction, but they all stay in very close touch with this church in California. And then a fifth source of globalization is what we might term the saturation effect. What I mean by that is that throughout most of American history, any of the resources that congregations were able to secure beyond what they needed themselves went to activities within the United States, to start other churches, to move west, to move with the frontier, and so forth. And even as recently as the years right after World War II, that was still happening. There was a post-World War II boom in construction, an increase in church attendance, and most of the resources were being expended locally. And that led to a lot of growth within the United States, but it turns out that even the denominations that were growing the most rapidly in the 1970s have kind of peaked out. They've saturated the market, so to speak. For instance, the Southern Baptist Convention had a 2.3% annual growth rate in the 1970s, but since 1996 it's grown by only 0.6% annually. That's actually less than the general population is growing, about half as much. The Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, earlier had an enormous growth rate. In the last decade in the United States, they've only grown at 0.4% annually. Or the Assemblies of God had an annual growth rate of 9.2% in the 1970s, but only 1.8% in the late 1980s. What that has meant is that church leaders in those kinds of denominations, of course, have focused on still growing within the United States, but they've also shifted more of their attention overseas, where presumably the markets are larger. For instance, the Southern Baptist Convention, which has grown about a third since the 1970s in the United States, has more than doubled its foreign missionary staff. Well, I mentioned at the start that I'd also talk about some of the challenges ahead. So one such challenge is balancing the local and the global. That's seldom easy because congregations, even if they want to do some kind of work globally, are very heavily tilted toward local activities. Friends and family are of greatest interest. Pastors are overwhelmed and overworked. So it has been historically necessary for religious organizations to establish very precise international organizations in order to keep this activity going if they wanted to keep it going. The second challenge is this very tricky balance between evangelism or proselytization, if you want to call it that, and humanitarian service on the other hand. Some of the most effective organizations, such as World Vision, which I mentioned earlier, have done a pretty good job of balancing that, but it's always difficult. There's pressures to be dealt with. For instance, a large share of the funding now for World Vision and Catholic Relief Services and World Relief, other such organizations, comes from the U.S. government. And when it does, then that, of course, prohibits proselytization. And so the organizations have to be very careful in how they manage those funds. And there are also ultimately theological questions involved about what exactly does it mean to be a Christian in a global and diverse world. A third challenge involves the balance of doing for and partnering with. Because for a long time, international religious organizations in the United States argued that they were simply partnering with indigenous organizations in other countries. And yet the reality was that the resources were flowing largely in one direction, of course, from a rich country to poorer countries. And with such a flow of resources, strings are usually attached as well. Or for instance, with the growing involvement of short-term mission volunteers, the argument is often that, well, they're going to partner with and they're going to learn from people in other countries, but that's without fully realizing that you can't learn very much about another country in 8 days, and you may be a considerable burden on the people who are hosting you for those 8 days. And then a fourth, really major challenge is coming to terms with the historic legacy of Christian efforts overseas. It's a legacy that many Americans, even those who are involved in these kinds of activities, are very ambivalent about. Because on the one hand, there are often gripping stories about missionaries who sacrificed themselves to help others or became martyred in the process and so forth. But there are just as many stories about the ugly American who goes abroad and bungles everything and tries to impose American things on everything else. And once again, the rise of short-term mission volunteers aggravates that problem. The head of one agency told us, she said, everybody wants to get on a plane and go overseas and solve people's problems. And then she added, gosh, what a headache. And the reason she felt that way is that people from the United States think they can fly to Africa or Latin America and teach people how they grow corn in Iowa, and that's somehow going to help them, or how they run a clinic in New Jersey, and that's going to work someplace else. And then finally, there's a challenge of trying to be the conscience of America in the world, which is what some of these people argue that they are. Conscience requires more than assuming that a person of faith can be guided silently by an internal compass. For people of faith, conscience is increasingly expressed in the very tangible social arrangements that connect the United States with the rest of humanity. And sometimes those are power relations, and sometimes those are exploitative relations, and sometimes those are helpful relationships. It's unlikely that the conscience of America will not again be tested in the near future. By all indications, terrorism, the threat of terrorism, and the global dispersion of weapons, large and small, will continue to pose dangers and evoke fears. Equally likely is the prospect of American decline, especially as military expenditures take their toll on the national economy, and as a political system that privileges short-term interests over long-term collective reason generates spiraling national debt and deteriorating national health care, and as the trade deficit puts U.S. interests increasingly in the hands of foreign creditors. When the familiar comforts of life erode in the United States, natural inclination is going to be to hunker down. And so the ease with which Americans have written checks for tsunami victims and sent their youth on mission trips to Guatemala will probably diminish. It'll be harder also for legislators to approve spending bills that include appropriations for foreign assistance. But the needs of families displaced by natural disasters, and of children whose parents have died of AIDS or been killed in bloody insurrections will not diminish. With declining resources, the national conscience then will be tested. It will be tempting for Christian leaders to imagine that the indigenous churches planted in better times will pick up the slack, that relief efforts will no longer be needed by the United States because they're being carried out by missionaries from Korea or Mexico or the Philippines or Ghana. The problem with this expectation is that worse conditions in the United States do not imply better conditions in these other countries. Were the United States to end its faith-based humanitarian efforts, there's also little reason to think that these efforts would be picked up by China or Japan or the European Union. So in conclusion, there's probably wisdom in the adage that being faithful is better even than being effective, as some people told us in this study. Because the conscience of a nation does not require its efforts to produce economic miracles. Conscience does necessitate, though, being steadfast. It involves the pursuit of that which is effective, and the knowledge, though, that failure will happen and successes will often be small. It does not mean becoming involved in hopeless tasks, but it does imply recognizing the responsibility humans bear to their species wherever they may live. Thank you. We have time for your comments or questions. Yes?
Do you anticipate a little different kind of evolution of these efforts going forward? I mean, you kind of follow the trend for the last 40 or 50 years, but it would seem that with the changing world picture and some of the radical religious elements around the world, there may be an evolution on this side. And what are your thoughts about what that might look like?
Well, there certainly is an evolution. There has been already, and if you look back over the almost 200 years since these kind of activities have been going on, you see quite a bit of change. One of the differences, as I alluded to a couple of times, is that the U.S. government is much more actively involved in these organizations. That's largely through the State Department, through USAID, that simply channels a lot of humanitarian aid through these religious organizations. Why? Because they're on the scene, they've got the expertise, they've got the staff, they know how to deliver the goods. That's probably going to continue, although humanitarian aid, we know from the past 50 years, fluctuates a lot depending on who's in power in Washington at the time. The character of those humanitarian efforts also shift. For instance, religious organizations were pretty slow in getting involved in HIV/AIDS efforts in Africa, but recently have started to be involved in a big way. But meanwhile, as you've read in the newspaper, some of the big donors who are basically running secular organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or Warren Buffett have stepped in a major way. But one can imagine, for instance, that other issues will come on the scene. One that a lot of people hope will come more on the radar screen is global warming and environmental issues. So that may be a new one. And then more closely related to what you're suggesting in your question, the fact that religions in other parts of the world, especially Islam, are very actively mobilized, and in some cases radical segments of Islam are actively mobilized, are really challenging how these predominantly Christian organizations do business overseas. We've had some speakers from some of these organizations here on campus in the last year or two, and it's quite interesting to hear them talk about being able to sit down side by side with Muslim leaders in Sudan or Nigeria and basically work on humanitarian issues that transcend the religious differences that have historically divided them. And I suspect that's going to be the kind of conversation that will increasingly have to take place in the future. Yeah.
You might explain this, and I might just understand. You said at the beginning that the current accepted theory is that there is that Christianity has kind of moved south. listed off what sounded like a lot of good reasons to doubt that being true. With all those reasons, why do they think, why do they believe in this paradigm? Why is there this theory of the paradigm?
Well, one of the reasons is that post-colonial theory has been very popular among the scholars that have formulated the new paradigm, meaning that it has really been politically incorrect to imagine that there are still these connections between the Western world or the global North and the South. It's been more politically correct to say, well, all of this is just kind of springing up purely from indigenous roots. But I could give you many examples from anthropological studies that show just in the remotest parts of the world you can imagine where people are still being influenced by globalization and by trade and the West and so forth. So even though it's indirect, sometimes the influences are there. Yes?
You're serving a number of religions, and I'm not currently strongly believe in any particular religion, but the one I have most experience with is Catholicism. Of course, I have it all, so I go and check it out occasionally. They have a sort of different structure in the way they take resources from local areas and do or don't spend, and they sort of go back to Rome or whatever. But they have a very interesting thing, and this might play into the earlier question. I've noticed that there's been sort of globalizing and exporting priests from the southern areas because they can't recruit enough priests in the United States. So they have a lot of priests that come from Latin America, places like that, and often parishes in the United States. So I get maybe that sort of feeds into this belief that somehow Christianity is stronger in the South,
Yeah.
because you see typically a Hispanic or African face in some of the Catholic Church.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. That's very true in Catholic parishes, especially as U.S. Catholicism itself is becoming more diverse, where some estimates suggest that at least a quarter of the U.S. Catholic population is now Hispanic, and many of those folks speak Spanish as their primary language. So having priests from someplace in Latin America is very valuable. On the other hand, if you look at the relative strength of the Catholic Church, and a lot of times we think, well, Latin America is so predominantly Catholic. Of course, it's become more Protestant in recent decades. It's still historically very Catholic. If you look at Brazil as probably the most affluent of countries in Latin America and compare the strength of the Catholic Church in Brazil with the strength of the Catholic Church in the U.S., it's just far stronger still in the U.S. Why? Because we're still just a much more affluent country even than Brazil is. But you're certainly right. There is some of this kind of traffic back from the global South, if you want to call it that, to America, to the U.S. as well. Yeah. Yes?
To some extent, you've described a lot of activity in the churches in the U.S. rather than a lot of results. In other words, a lot of visits, a lot of money is spent.
Right.
Is there any research from the other end, looking back, that says a third of the money and a third of the visits went to Africa, and what good things have come out of it in Africa or Latin America? Are we
Yeah,
training
yeah.
Catholics for fundamental Protestants in Latin
Right.
America?
Right.
What are we doing in Africa?
Right.
Is there any measure of the output of all of this activity?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's some evidence. There's not a whole lot because some of these organizations, claim, well, the results are kind of intangible. They're making people better people, or whatever. It's difficult to measure. It turns out, though, that one of the important influences of the increase in government funding for some of these humanitarian aid organizations is that they have to be accountable. They have to show some kind of results. And you actually do find, especially with the two largest organizations, World Vision and Catholic Relief Services, that they will go into a geographic area, and it may be a religiously mixed area, usually a very impoverished area, and they'll work with the entire array of social services that are needed, healthcare especially, but orphanages or schools or whatever it may be. And over a period of 10 years or so, you see measurable improvements in those areas, and you also see a kind of conscious attempt then to turn those areas back to their own resources at a point so they're not just permanently dependent on those organizations. But even when those kinds of measurements are made, the results are often mixed. For instance, there is a lot of research going on right now for some reason in Malawi, looking at HIV/AIDS prevention. And there's pretty substantial research that religious organizations are making an important difference there. These are Muslim organizations as well as Christian organizations. They know how to advertise, they know how to put pressure on local men, for instance. They're also engaged in microfinance loan programs. It seems to work there. On the other hand, there's also a lot of that kind of activity, especially the microfinance loan activity in rural China. And it doesn't seem to be working very well in rural China. And that's despite the fact that some of these Christian organizations like World Vision are working shoulder to shoulder with the Chinese government, which is quite phenomenal in itself and may have kind of long-term partnership implications. But in the short run, the microfinance loans are set up on a model, kind of Western model, that says if anybody in the village defaults on their loan, then nobody in the village gets a loan the next year. But that's not how the local networks work. They are more dyadic rather than whole village in orientation. And so those programs have had some success, but not nearly as much as either the Chinese government or these religious organizations had hoped. Yeah, Bill?
Thank you for your interesting research. I had one question. Could you draw a parallel of the Christian growth in comparison with Islam? They're both evidently expanding, and I just wondered if you had some sort of rough guide as to are they equally expanding or is one expanding more?
Islam's growing a lot faster than Christianity. Worldwide, over the last century, Christianity has been about a third of the world population, and that has been pretty constant. The so-called growth that these people talk about in the Southern Hemisphere is largely just the fact that the population is growing. So it's not that the proportion of Christians are growing, whereas Islam has grown. I don't remember by how much, but significantly more than the relatively flat trend for Christianity. Sir?
Can you tell me if you know what percentage of humanitarian Christian aid goes to non-Christians? Would it be desirable for it to be a larger percentage?
I don't know the exact percent, and I'm not sure if anybody does know that. What I do know is that there is some statistical evidence that this is slightly different than what you're asking, that all U.S. foreign aid, we're talking about government foreign aid now, goes slightly more toward Christian countries in the world than would be just at random. It suggests there's some kind of influence or cultural tie or whatever. Undoubtedly, the private aid that's funneled through Christian organizations goes disproportionately to Christian countries or populations that are Christian. Africa is probably the biggest recipient, but there are some other countries, Philippines, certain countries in Central America, mostly Christian. The biggest exceptions are, in fact, countries that have, that have significant Muslim populations. So for instance, there's quite a bit of support going to Nigeria and to Sudan and Somalia at this point. China, I suppose it would be hard to say. For instance, in rural China, some of the population are Christian, but more likely they are some kind of folk religion or syncretic religion. But that's really about all one can say. It's not going exclusively to Christian populations, but certainly quite a bit of it is. Yes. Yeah.
Do you know can you compare the amount of contributions that go through Christian organizations to global people, and the comparison between that and contributions to secular organizations?
Oh, it's by far larger for religious organizations, and most of those religious organizations would be Christian organizations. The secular organizations that you read about are usually the foundations, like the Gates Foundation, for instance, or they might include something like the International Red Cross. And when you factor in those organizations that are kind of a hybrid between government and private voluntary contributions, then those secular organizations are certainly significant.
Or UNICEF or Oxfam?
Yeah. Those are significant as well. I don't remember. I once looked at, for the U.S., let's say that the top 20 international humanitarian aid organizations, and about half of them were religious organizations and about half weren't. Okay, thank you. Yep.